Peace and blessings. I have decided to make a short video. It may not be that short, for educational purposes. For people who have any interest in the so-called 5 civilized tribes, their relationships with our ancestors, black people. I'm talking about our African slave ancestors who were enslaved not only by the United States of America, the English, the French, the Portuguese, and others, but it has come to light, which I've been knowing about for personal reasons, but probably more people. I heard Roland Martin, he had an interview dealing with a lawsuit that was filed by an attorney, a brother, black American out of Oklahoma, against the Creek Nation, because the blacks that were a part of the Creek Nation before slavery, there was a treaty of 1866 that the Creek Nation entered into with the United States government, giving all the blacks that were a part of that nation, and they were slaves for the most part before it ended, giving them full citizenship rights and responsibilities. And this was in effect from 1866, I think, until 1979, when the blacks were put out of the nation. Cherokee Nation did the same thing. We know about the Trail of Tears. It was the Creek, which my ancestors were a part of, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. The Seminole, from what I understand, were the strongest of those 5 civilized tribes in resisting the Caucasians. They fought them probably for 100 years, and they were never totally defeated in Florida. The Seminoles originally were a part of the Creek Federation. They were all from Alabama and Georgia. I think the Creeks were in Alabama, but those 5 so-called civilized tribes were in the southeastern quadrant of the United States, what later became the United States of America. So the Seminole were a part of the Creek Federation. They had what they called, if I remember right, the Red Stick War. And I think it was 1814. And the Seminole broke off from the Creek and created their own federation. Okay. So they talk about, on Roland Martin and other blacks, we're shocked and surprised that Indians owned slaves. And it's probably only those so-called 5 civilized tribes, and that's probably why they're referred to as such, because evidently they were more influenced by Caucasian and white America than the Apache, the Arapaho, the Lakota Sioux, and the other 100 and however many nations there were of natives. There's a lot of them. In fact, the whole North American and South American continent was populated by native people, what we call Indian, from Brazil to Canada. Yeah, and so I'm just talking about these 5 so-called civilized tribes. My great-great-great-grandfather was owned by a Creek so-called Indian named Rollie McIntosh. Rollie McIntosh was a chief, I think, of the Lower Creeks. There were Upper Creeks and Lower Creek. That's the designation, 2 different divisions of them. Some more amiable, I think, to outside influence than the other. But Rollie McIntosh owned my great-great-great-grandfather. My great-great-grandmother, his daughter, one of his children, she was owned by a lady named Eliza Gooden. I have in the Creek Nation, have another ancestors owned by McGillivray or something like that, Creek Nation. The point I'm getting to is this. When they say, yeah, Indians own black, yeah, I thought so too, and they did. But what I didn't understand until a couple years ago, I was in Kansas City, Missouri, and I went to the Midwest Genealogical Society Library. It's a big, beautiful building off of 39th Street. I think it's on 32nd and Lee Summit Road in Kansas City. It's actually Independence, but I just say Kansas City. Big, beautiful building. They have extensive archives. You know, the Mormons have a big influence in Kansas City because when they were going to Utah, they stopped in Independence, Missouri first. They still have a big footprint there. So I'm looking through, I'm at the library in Independence, the Midwest Genealogical Society Library, and I got the microfiche. I had the microfiche, and I'm going through the census. of 1834, I think. I went through a couple of them, and I think it was before the removal. They called it the Indian Removal Act. May have been under Andrew Jackson, the Indian killer. Yeah, that's how he was known, president. Anyway, I think one of the censuses I looked at was before the removal, or it was during that time. And my great-great-great-grandparents, Aaron Renty, I call him, he's known by other names, and Charity Grayson, whom they had 3 children with, and he had children with 2 other women. There was 9 kids altogether, Pickett Renty being the oldest one, born in 1822, who Daniel F. Littlefield used to be a professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He wrote a book called Africa and Creeks that explains that relationship and gives a lot of depth to it, Africans and Creeks. He sent me information on my family personally when I wrote him in the 1980s when I first got into this search. Anyway, so I'm getting off track. So I'm looking at these censuses. It's either during the time of the, they call it the Trail of Tears, and we used to think it's only the Cherokee. No, it was 5 nations on the Trail of Tears in the dead of winter, marched out of their homeland in Georgia and Alabama on foot, and a lot of them died along the way. My ancestors survived, the ones that I'm directly descended from. A lot of them died on the way in the dead of winter, froze to death, starved, whatever. Called the Trail of Tears. It wasn't just Cherokee. It was the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, along with the Cherokees. And they settled them in what they called Indian Territory, which later became the state of Oklahoma. My point is, as I looked through the archives at the Genealogical Society in Independence, Missouri, I realized that they have the slave schedule. Well, they weren't slave schedules, they have the households. See, they studied those 5 tribes, and they've kept records of them, census records and travel records and all kind of records since the 1800s. And Roland Martin, or somebody said, he didn't say it, probably the guy he was talking to, the blacks that were amongst those 5 tribes are probably the most thoroughly documented blacks in America, because they were with those people and the government was keeping track of them and everybody that was with them. So what I realized when I'm looking at the census records that the government took of these nations, of the Creek Nation specifically, almost every so-called Creek that owned slaves had a European name. I saw a few, very few, that had Indian, and you can definitely distinguish between Native American name and European name. They sound nothing alike. You can't even pronounce the Native American name unless you're good with linguistics, which I'm not. So McIntosh is a Scottish name. McGillery or whatever, I don't know what kind of name it is, it's not an Indian name. Eliza Gooden, it's a European name, it's not an Indian name. These are the ones that own my ancestors, but they were a part of that Creek Federation. So if you look at that movie that they made about the Osage Indians a few years ago, that was shocking and truthful. Can't remember the name of it, I wish I could. It was about the Osage Indians and how the whites intermarried among them and murdered a lot of them that they married, and killed a lot of them, poisoned them in all kind of ways in order to get the land. I say that the black American athlete is the new victim of the Osage murders, and maybe that's what it was called, I can't remember. Well, so it was the same with the Creek Federation. There were Caucasians who had become ingrained in the nation. Roland McIntosh was a chief. McIntosh, he may have been a half-breed. He wasn't no full-blooded Creek with a name like McIntosh. He wasn't no 1/4 of a Creek. He was probably at least a half Creek and half European. He may have been an all European. The point is, yes, the Indian, the 5 civilized tribes, some of them own slaves, our ancestors. But from what I saw in the census that the United States took of the Creek Nation in the 1830s, they had all of them there. If it was an Indian, he owned 1 slave, and there wasn't many of them that owned 1. For every Indian that owned a slave was 100 or 125 that didn't own any. And for every Indian that owned slave, the vast majority had 1, maybe 2. And when you saw the slave listed with the master, and you saw 20 and 10 and 15 and 25 and 50, all of them had European names. So don't get it twisted. We easily get things twisted because we don't do no research. We get emotional. We don't think about it. We don't understand what the heck's going on. So I just wanted to share that information because it's important. Peace.